Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining for episode 9 of Meet Me for Coffee. Can't believe we are already 9 episodes into this, but I have enjoyed everyone so far and appreciate you guys all for joining. I hope we have some people coming with questions today. I did also get quite a few questions submitted before the show for this episode, so we're going to have plenty of time at the end today to answer those questions. If you did submit a question to me, and we don't get to it, I'm sorry. We might not have time to address them all, but we're going to do our best. So today I'm going to have Steve Kochan join us. He is the CEO and founder of ComFreight and HaulPay. And we're going to go ahead and bring him in. I'm going to let him introduce himself here. Steve, good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Samantha. Nice to be on the show.
I feel your pain because on my last show, I was in California. So I know I have you up really early this morning, but I appreciate you making it work Pacific time for us today.
It's totally fine. I got my coffee here too. So
perfect. It is moving for
brains
coffee.
It's getting up there. So
well, this is going to wake you up because we got some really good questions today. So we're going to start the day strong. But do us a favor before we jump into any discussion topics or questions today. And can you just kind of briefly explain your background and what you do currently with HaulPay and ComFreight?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my career in supply chain logistics at C.H. Robinson, actually back in 2008, which gives me kind of an interesting perspective from a cycle of the market for experience, and then I worked at a couple startup freight brokerages and forwarders. So went from having that Fortune 100 top of the heap brokerage resources to a startup environment where you really had to kind of piece everything together, patchwork, and make stuff work. And back in 2010 through like 2013-ish, there wasn't nearly as much freight tech as we have in the last 3 to 5 years now. So that really was kind of the thing that spurred me to start building a better load board at first. Started that as a side project in 2013. And then in 2016, I made the decision to start a pivot and start building a small team and actually turn this into a real company. And that's really when ComFreight started to move into factoring. And then now we've moved into digital payments and automating a lot of the workflows around that. So HaulPay is ComFreight's key product. And we basically provide digital invoice factoring, financing, and payment automation for the industry.
So I do have one question, and I think it's going to be kind of pertinent to the conversation we're about to have today. But can you tell us, HaulPay being the payment side, the kind of like factoring service, was it designed more for brokers or for carriers or for both? Like what areas do you guys predominantly service?
Yeah, so from the very beginning, it was intended to become a product for both. In fact, we actually have a future feature set that we've been developing just in the last quarter or so that will even extend this out to shippers who want to have digital automation in their payables for whoever they're paying, right? Carriers or brokers. So I've always been trying to keep the technology agnostic as far as it addressing the challenges of all parties in the industry, because frankly, they all interact at some point, right? And they're all tied together in some way, shape, or form. You really can't have one without the other, right? Anywhere down the chain. So we started with carriers because the load board had kind of been like the way the company started. So it just made sense that we had brokers posting loads on the load board app to just roll in an easy way for carriers to get paid quickly. And they would be the clients of ours in that experience. And then the broker factoring, and then eventually broker digital payments. It's a little more complex workflow because now you're dealing with the shipper when you're doing billing for the broker, if the broker wants us to do that. And then you're dealing with making sure the carrier is a legit carrier and paying them out the other side at the right time. All the timing of that, the accounting, all of that had to be built out. And then once you do those two things, the shipper's, relatively straightforward because we're already billing the shipper half the time, right? So, and that's kind of how it all came together. And that's where we're at today. We've pretty much gotten to most of the stuff in the roadmap that was on the list back in 2016. So,
well, congratulations on that. And I do think that, you brought up an excellent point, is that a lot of companies only do payments and factoring for carriers. And it's pretty much just, hey, you're working with your client and then one other party, the broker or the shipper. But once you start stepping into working with the brokers, now you have them as your client, but then you have both of their clients, the carriers and the shippers. So it is a little bit different of a ball game once you get into the brokerage space. So nice call out there on that. Okay, so we're going to jump right into this. And the goal for this episode is to help some people understand a topic that I think is extremely important in the industry, but not discussed enough. I don't know if it's just a money thing. Maybe sometimes people don't like talking about money, right? But I think there is just an unavoidable part of our industry that cash flow will either make or break you in especially the broker and carrier side of this industry. It's obviously very important for the shippers too, for any company to have a strong cash flow, but just by nature of the industry, it seems a little bit more difficult when we're talking about the carriers and the brokerage space. So just from a high level, can we just talk about for a minute, I'd like to get your thoughts on how important is cash flow in this industry and what are the potential effects that negative cash flow can have on companies?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, yeah, going back to the CH Robinson days, right? So, like, it was really easy for me to just offer a quick pay, right? Because you got this huge, corporation that's up there and
got a nice bank behind you.
NASDAQ. Yeah, right, and probably multiple banks, right?
Yeah.
So, cash flow is really important for a couple of different reasons. Biggest reason is you've got shippers typically on one side that are going to have some sort of set terms that are baked into some very, more strategic financial model that they're operating on. And most of the time, shippers are going to be larger companies than the brokers and the carriers actually servicing them, right? So even though they may want longer terms than maybe a carrier wants to get paid downstream, they're usually going to be also may have a deeper pockets overall.
Right.
So we've really taken that into account and said, if we're going to do financing for the industry, we're going to do it non-recourse for the broker and the carrier in most situations, because the shipper is likely to have just more capital overall. They're going to be a larger entity. Yeah. But that doesn't change the fact that the shipper wants to pay invoices in 30 days or 45 days or 60 days or sometimes even 90 days in some cases. And then the carrier needs to get paid usually within 1 to 15 or 1 to 21 days, somewhere in that range. And if the carrier has a factoring company, that factoring company is expecting to get paid no later than day 30, right? So, as a brokerage, you're sitting in between these two parties and you have this kind of little bit of tension because you've got to figure out a way to operate in the middle of that scenario, have enough cash flow to satisfy not just paying your carriers, but their factoring companies when they have one. If you don't, then your credit will fall out of favor, and it'll make it even harder for you to book carriers in the spot market, sometimes even on contract freight. So there's all these things kind of fit together on that side. So having a way to kind of address that, that's one of the things that HaulPay is really set out to address is how do we keep the cash flow at just the right speed for all parties on the chain, and let the shippers still operate within the terms that they have to operate in, just given their financial strategy.
Yeah, I would say, obviously we have kind of a similar background in that I started with a much larger organization too. So I would say cash flow in the industry is obviously going to be most important because it's going to make or break you when you're starting a company. So for these younger, smaller brokerages or even carriers, asset fleets, unless you're starting with a nice pocket of change, right? Unless you have that nice, healthy reserve or you have some backing when you're funding and starting your company, you don't really have a lot of options. You kind of essentially have to find someone who can partner with you, whether you try to make that a bank line of credit, if you're able to manage that, or like a factoring partner, because going into business, especially depending on the area that you service, you're going immediately into likely minimum 30-day pay terms. Mm-hmm. So you'd have to, at best,
30
days of freight without getting a single paycheck, right? And so I think that's where, we would talk about cash flow is king. And I've experienced it now coming to more of a startup and us working on that. Hey, there's my CEO, by the way, saying cash flow is king. So I think that's a great call out, is that you either have to be able to self-finance or you have to be able to find a partner who can help you through that. Now, I will say, just because an organization gets bigger, like the organizations that we've come from, doesn't mean that cash flow doesn't matter anymore. In fact, there's still a lot of importance placed on those AP teams and those collection teams and making sure that the money is getting paid, because the larger you grow, the easier it is for things to start getting a little out of control, right? Slipping through the cracks. And next thing you know, I lived it, right? I was in a big organization. I had big shippers, and I would get every couple of weeks, I'd get the over 120 day Excel file, and they'd be like, hey, we've had
Yep.
enough of this. You take it. Like, you
Right.
can
Yeah.
figure it
Yeah.
out now. And it's like, oh, you have thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars outstanding over 120 days. And those are things that no matter the size of your organization, you're still going to have to reconcile and handle those.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. I mean, that's one of the things I think we're really proud of here too with the HaulPay product is, we can help brokers basically. We're basically, funding their cash flow, right?
Yeah.
And the way we do it is not like a traditional factoring arrangement. It's non-recourse from a credit perspective. We have some flexibility if there's special cases, but you're basically able to finance that AP flow and have the option to take also accelerate your broker margins, right? So we
Right.
also have some newer brokers or just brokers. Some cases are startups. They want to pay their salespeople faster, so they'll take they'll speed up their own cash flow so they can pay those out faster, knowing that we're kind of backstopping most of their credit risk, which is also something that's kind of new to the industry. So it really is about kind of leveling the playing field, and when you have again like that big company cash flow, that credit decisioning, that shielding you as an operator inside that company from a lot of the risk. We're trying to be that platform to kind of bridge that gap for the small mid-sized players that hopefully grow to be large ones. And we do have clients that have grown significantly with us over the last couple of years. And I've asked I'm actually going to go visit one of our largest customers at the end of the week up here in Reno. And I said, hey, why aren't you guys moving away from factoring? Like, honestly, you guys do so much for us.
Yeah.
Just with the back office, like it's not even that much of a cost to us. We just really just keep the train going. So
no,
so it is interesting and
find those effective partnerships. It's a lot more than just like the cash flow part of it too, because there's services that come into it too. So, hey, I have another question
definitely.
that I think is going to help kind of address this topic too. So I kind of put this tagline in the description of this episode, but I'm noticing a trend where we're seeing shippers start to push out their payment terms farther and farther. Maybe they went from 30 to 60, 60 to 90, and we're seeing a lot more 120 day terms popping up out there too with these bigger guys and maybe even just like medium-sized shippers. But what do you think ultimately will happen as these 120 day terms become a little bit more commonplace in this industry? I think what I want to talk about today, because this is pertinent for anyone who's listening, whether they're a broker, a carrier, or a shipper. Understanding the impact of these extended pay terms. And what got me thinking about it is when you just said like, hey, why are you still factoring with us? Like you're growing. I think from the provider side of the table, no matter how big you grow, if you can take 120 day pay terms and make that somebody else's responsibility, even for a small fee, it's always probably going to be a more attractive option than holding that in-house.
Yeah, for sure.
So I don't know that you necessarily ever outgrow a partnership with someone like HaulPay as a broker if we're going to see more and more shippers in this industry transitioning to these longer and longer pay terms. And so, I mean, I'm just
for at least for a while, right? We that may change, but for the foreseeable future, I agree with you. I don't think we're going to see. I mean, put yourself in their shoes, right? There's going to be some tightening in commercial credit. That's just normal in any time you have any kind of financial turbulence. So that affects shippers sometimes even more because they are usually the ones that rely more heavily on some sort of bank financing. So that cost of capital goes up as the Fed raises rates, and then you've got them wanting to stretch out so they can offer their customers, the larger POs, a little bit better terms, and it all filters down to the transportation providers and some of their other vendors, right? So
I would say, talking from the shipper side, and I've never been a shipper, I've talked to shippers, but I can say, especially with these larger guys who are the ones we typically see with these longer pay terms, a common theme across these is obviously that they're publicly traded companies. And so there's a lot of emphasis and pressure put on their quarterly earnings, on their books. And so when you're able to stretch payments out over an entire quarter instead of, 30 days, 45 days, I do think that there's some, like, even the initial transition, let's say you're on 60 days and you all of a sudden push to 120 days and you guys are in a pretty rough spot with your books, like it's immediately going to boost what you seem to be operating at, if that makes sense.
Definitely. Yeah, we've seen, so in our experience, we've seen shippers do that over time. We haven't seen like, I mean, that could change. I mean, we're definitely seeing some of that now a little more abruptly. I think the well-run shipper organizations that have, at least some logistics management that's really conscious of, their vendors is going to try to ratchet it out over time.
Yeah.
Because they could also shock, if they've got certain set of carriers or contract providers, they also, the good ones are usually mindful of the fact that they don't want to shock those vendors into scrambling to figure out a way to make up that time period they're waiting for payment. So, but like you said, in some cases they're going to just go for it in this environment. And yeah, we can't help. And it's trying to be dynamic. I mean, we focus really heavily on software. Like, we see ourselves as financial technology companies. So, and I think that's important, having a provider that has a focus on the technology, because it allows you to see and interpret situations, manage those situations differently than other options, which what we try to focus on, that flexibility, right? So if a broker comes and says, hey, we have a client, they have to operate this way, they're a shipper. Okay, let's figure out what we can do to make this work for everybody. Well, yeah. And we're all relatively de-risking the situation. And I think with our technology and a lot of the team experience we have, a lot of our team's been freight brokerages in different parts of the freight cycles over the years. That's also been a big benefit to our clients. So
I like what you said there real quick. I'm going to call it out because you said, we have a shipper. This is how they operate. Okay, that's how this industry goes, right? Like,
right.
It is a bunch of carriers and brokers adhering to the shipper's terms, pretty much regardless of what those terms are. And so there might be
it's hard, right? Because then you'll just get bid out or something.
Yeah, there might be some negotiation in legal contracts or pay terms, but like, especially if you're trying to gain entry into a shipper, you're probably not in a position to try to negotiate on the, off of their terms. And that's just how the industry works. I always tell people who maybe are kind of new to the contracting side of things, or they're coming into the industry, like, this is one of the only industries I know where the people providing all the services dictate zero of the terms. Like, I mean, it's the truth behind it. But I think that partnering with someone on the payment side is probably one of the only ways that a lot of these carriers and brokers have the ability to agree without having to negotiate on these terms, or at least have the confidence that they're able to agree, instead of going, all right, we're going to do this ourselves, but like, man, if they're a bad payer and we don't know that, we're going to be in a really bad spot really fast. I also want to,
it helps to have that backup with a technology provider, with something like that.
Call out real quick before we move off of the 120-day terms. It's not just about do you have 120-day terms? I don't care if you have a 60-day terms. If you pay in 120 days,
oh
you
yeah,
can have the same problem as someone with 120-day terms who pays in 120 days. So it doesn't really matter what you say your terms are. It matters in what you pay from the shipper side. So I did get a question, and we're already at the 20-minute mark. So I'm going to jump into some of our questions. And this one's right on that topic. And this was a shipper, and they said that, let's see here, I want to make sure I don't put words in their mouth. Well, we see carriers, brokers in this cash constrained economic environment move to higher margin industries. So for example, moving from agricultural to medical to improve their margins. Are they supporting the wrong industry from a profitability perspective? I'm going to break that off, the second part, into second question. Okay. So do you think that you guys have seen people trying to transition out of different industries that they're servicing in a lower part of a cycle?
So I've noticed this with brokerages. We've noticed it with brokerages. We haven't noticed this as much with carriers.
Okay.
So we've definitely seen some of our larger broker clients transitioning to commodities that are resilient into real economic times, the savvy ones. So, and in fact, maybe the margins aren't as good with ag as medical, but ag's a lot better than a lot of other things, right?
Yeah.
Right. So probably one of the top ones. We see ag, we're really excited. Okay, that's pretty resilient, right? So,
agriculture
it is relative.
Agriculture is actually a really hot sector right now. It's projected to have a really good year when a lot of other industries are really bad.
Exactly.
So maybe it's not so much just about the margins that people perceive as it is the overall volumes that are going to be.
I agree completely. It's not, yeah. And you got to be a little longer term thinking too. Like what is going to be the most resilient, depending on where you're at in the medical chain, it could be something that's, you know, that the volume of that freight may be a lot less and the opportunities could be a lot smaller, just even by
Right.
tonnage or something. Right. So there's other considerations. So we definitely see some movement for the broker clients. Carriers, not as much, or not as much that at least I'm aware of today. Most of them are actually just trying to get more closer, like especially the smaller and more established mid-sized fleets that we have as
Right.
carrier clients for HaulPay are just trying to get closer to their brokers that they really trust, the ones that do the most work with them, trying to make sure that they have clear communication on pricing and that
Okay.
they
Wait.
can collaborate more tightly. That's what we've seen with the biggest seem to be most strategic operating carrier fleets that we
So the
have
second
open
part of this
office.
question was kind of that. And it says, will you see a shift from carriers working directly with shippers and moving away from brokers to eliminate the 10 to 12% margin? So I think you guys just kind of touched on that,
I
right?
think you're going to see, yeah, I think you're going to see carriers that are going to try in some cases. But I think the best hedge as a carrier is to get closer with your best brokers at the same time. I think there'll be carriers that are going to try to get direct carrier relationships. But again, what we've seen most historically with our best carrier clients and what we're seeing again now in these cycles when the trucking market's a little more difficult is that they seem to double and triple down on their best broker relationships. And I think it's important as a broker to try to meet them in the middle in some cases too, right? Because if you have a really strong carrier, you can really supply a high degree of service to your shipper customer, right? And it makes that carrier feel like an extension of your operation rather than someone you're brokering this service out to.
Yeah.
We think that's a more likely scenario, and we're seeing that more frequently.
I did ask Tim, he's our senior vice president. He's more on the carrier side, our network design. And so I asked him the same question so we could represent, right, a broker's viewpoint here as well. And he does a lot of consulting with our mid-sized fleets. And, his little bit of expertise that he lended here was that if you want to transition, really, like truly commit to transitioning more from going from a broker relationship to getting most of your freight into a direct relationship with shippers, it's like a 12 to 18 month process usually before you start to see any type of gains or rewards from that process. And during that time, you're actually probably going to crunch your cash flow because brokers don't just send over loads. Like brokers are manpower for a lot of these fleets, scheduling deliveries, scheduling pickups, handling integrations with track and trace, paying they pay for all the direct EDI tracking integrations that otherwise the carriers would be paying for with the shippers. So there's actually a lot of costs that go into, running direct with shippers.
Well, we see it. We just see it with like what we had to build to do broker factoring and payments, like how many features and moving pieces to just that in our own software versus carrier factoring. It's like 1/10 the amount of scope for the software piece that runs the carrier factoring.
That's
like
awesome.
So that shows you there's just so many moving pieces to what the broker is having to touch that alleviates a lot of the overhead that maybe the carriers don't even realize. So
I mean, just this week, I vice president of revenue, so I see some expenses that flow through, and we paid $500 to submit a specific type of ESG questionnaire, for one particular shipper, just to be able to
one shipper, right?
Yeah, and then there's another one that you're going to pay $1,000 for that, a different ESG, and then you're going to pay $3,000 for the EDI setup, or it's
a technology layer. I mean, brokerages are becoming a technology layer. I think it's awesome. I mean, but it's really like how you run your tech stack and how you manage that communication flow and optimize the parts of the supply chain is really,
man, we just
really
stumbled
where
on
it's
like
going.
a whole other like subtopic that could be discussed at length. It's like all of that goes on. But I do think that was a great answer to that question. I had another question come through. This is more for the smaller carriers. From a freight factoring perspective and with increased payment terms, are you seeing more owner operators use a factoring company to float their funds? And at what point will it break? Does HaulPay provide fuel advances for carriers?
Yeah, so the answer is yes and yes. I mean, typically, we've seen carriers in most environments, especially smaller carriers, owner operators, smaller fleets. They've always, in most cases, either have a factor, or
Right.
even if they take a broker quick pay, they're selectively factoring certain brokers and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes not others.
Yeah.
That's very common. I mean, it's everywhere. So I think in a more difficult environment, I think it serves the carrier well, especially if they can find a good non-recourse option, which is something that we do for carriers, that they kind of have that credit risk backstopped, and they're protected against that, and they have the option to use some a service like ours. One thing that we also do often is we'll match broker quick pay rates, so the carrier can keep all their payments in one spot with one app, and just makes their whole back office more efficient too, right? So as far as the fuel advances go, we've seen carriers that will, factor selectively and then take fuel advances from brokers, but they'll also, in some cases, won't want to do that with their factors. What we usually do is we'll usually give them a certain amount of time, especially if they're a newer carrier as an authority, usually 3 months or so, to make sure there's no funny business, because you do see an increase in fraud and payment fraud in a more tumultuous market.
I want to put that out there for any brokers that are listening, just because, this is something that I was just listening to our senior VP talk about, is that there's a lot of scummy players out there in the market right now. Like, we talk about double brokering. We know that that's going on, right? But there's people who have gotten a little bit more creative now. And it's like, hey, why try to be a double broker when I can just ask for a fuel advance and then never actually hold a load? So like, say, hey, I'm here to pick up, like, I need fuel advance, and then
or spoofing. That's another one.
Yeah, don't pick up a load.
Yeah.
So
don't spoof another broker on a load board. Like, that's the one you really got to watch out for. And it's a really difficult one to protect against, right? So
yeah, I would just say, if you're a pretty established broker and you don't have any issues with your authority being new or anything like that, and you have people really pushing hard for fuel advances, it's probably almost a red flag. And like, just
I would definitely be careful. Yeah, I mean, one thing that we do, that most of the carrier, to our knowledge, no onboarding provider does, is we verify the banking and payee information specifically to the carrier payees in our network. So if you're a broker and you want to pay a carrier, if you're not working with us, it's kind of on you to make sure you're paying a legit carrier, is actually that corporate office or home office of that carrier. So just another thing, if you don't use something like HaulPay, just make sure you're verifying in whatever way you can that carrier really is who you're paying.
Yep. Couldn't have said that one better myself. All right, we got a couple more questions. Let's try to fit in here. We might go a minute over. But let's go ahead and get to Ian's question here in the comments. I liked that one. He said, how have factor rates been affected by the interest rates roller coaster we have been riding the last year? What makes someone a good candidate for factoring?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are factoring companies that we've noticed this, have basically said to their clients, like, hey, the rates are going to go up. We're going to sign another 2-year agreement so we can lock you in a lower rate. Now, we don't do that. We have like a fixed max rate that we go to, and we've figured out our unit economics where we're able to continue to offer those kind of like base rates, and we don't have a variable rate to our clients. So we don't see that in our foreseeable future either. So I think that makes it just easier for prospective clients to price it. A good candidate for factoring, well, I think it depends on the factoring arrangement. So again, the way that we've tried to do this is, rework how factoring was traditionally done. So it's a lot better to the small and mid-size market businesses that typically would need to access to financing. For example, by default, our program does not create debt on your balance sheet. It's not a debt instrument. It's not like a loan. And most broker factoring, for example, is recourse factoring. So every single account is recourse. It's not selective, where we're working on like a selective option like that. So I think that's important.
Can you explain that real quickly in layman's terms for people who aren't familiar? I think what you're saying there, right, is that you take our risk off of us if they become a defaulted payer, right?
Right. So so if we're going to extend credit to finance either your quick pays or your margin advances as a broker through HaulPay, by default, we're taking on the credit risk, right? So most factors, almost every broker factoring company we've seen, or there's a handful out there that do it now, it's a recourse arrangement. If you read the fine print, which means if that invoice isn't paid by a certain date, it charges back to you. It's now due by you, the broker, and then they start. In most cases, they start assessing additional interest costs on top of that. So it gets really expensive, really fast, rather than having kind of peace of mind that that's not going to be the case. We've talked about doing selective cases where we can extend a bit more credit if the broker's willing to take on some of the risk with us. But by default, we try to mitigate your debt exposure by leveraging our technology. So that's something important to look at when you're considering a program. But I mean, it's really, if you can find a program like that, which I'm a little partial to us, right? We kind of went down the road.
A little biased, maybe, yeah.
A little biased, but there are. So far, we haven't found one. But if you can find one where you can mitigate your debt exposure and also shield yourself from some of these market risks, then almost anybody is a good candidate if you're comfortable with how they're going to operate on a day-to-day level for the business.
And I'm going to add a little bit to that part of his question from my point of view, because I kind of forgot to mention this earlier, but as a broker who does interact in the enterprise space, and we see these 120-day terms now with a few shippers, even if, like I said, we were stronger on our cash flow and we self-financed 100% of our business, we will probably always still elect to use a partner like HaulPay for our longer payment term customers. And we understand too that, when someone like HaulPay is doing this, there's a cost associated with this, obviously. And when we're extending past 30 days, I'm sure that percentage cost, while not exorbitant, it increases from 30 to 60 or 60 to 90 and 90 to 120, as it should. That's how you guys make money. That's how you stay in business, to help other people. But I'm just saying, as a broker, if my cost to service a shipper are going to increase because I have to float you 120-day terms and I'm going to choose to do that through a partner, even if I did it internally, you still have to assess cost to do that, right? Because
it's a surprise sometimes. Like, all of a sudden they're having credit issues. Now you get a big receivable that you have to pay out. So we try to price that into our model, and we work with our clients as partners to say, hey, they're going out to like 120. We'll work out something in the pricing where it covers us a bit, it covers you, but you still have that risk protection. So I think it's really about the partnership and then kind of leveraging the technology to make it possible.
And the last point I would say on that for any shippers or even brokers or carriers in the audience, like, you should be assessing that as a cost to operate with that account. And that absolutely is something that, just like how carriers need to build wear and tear on their equipment into their line haul rates, brokers and carriers need to build extended pay terms, knowing that you are paying more for that into your line haul rates. Like, that is absolutely something that 100%. You should be taking care of yourself on. Don't just,
if you can, definitely, yes.
Eat it as a cost of doing business if it's going to eat into margins that are, already reasonably fair there. So that's what I would say. That's my 2 cents to shippers, is that we still love you. We're still going to work with you with those 120-day terms, but there is a cost of doing business that you essentially are removing from yourself and transitioning to us.
You're floating them money.
Absolutely. I just became your bank, so I'm going to charge interest.
There you go.
So awesome. Well, Steve, we are out of time, but if anybody wants to listen back to this, or you come back to this live later and you want to drop some questions in the comments, just tag Steve. I'm pretty sure he's happy to jump back in if you have questions for him about what HaulPay does, about the industry in general, or myself. We can jump in there and answer some questions in the comments at any point. And this will be available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and it'll stay here on LinkedIn afterwards if you guys had to jump off and you want to come back. So Steve, thank you so much for meeting me for coffee today.
Yeah, thank you.